Hey everyone, thanks for checking out part 3 of my Nintendo 3DS retrospective. This part has been a long time coming, mostly because I didn't think the 3DS was going to keep going that much longer. I was going to wait to let part 3 be the last part. But after the Nintendo Switch launched, Nintendo started announcing a bunch of stuff and the 3DS is still going strong. So in this video, I'm going to cover releases from 2015 and 2016. I'm surprised that a lot of games keep getting announced for the 3DS instead of the Switch. I could imagine them putting out games on both, but this time we're going to cover the games that came out in 2015 and 2016, so let's get right into it. We start off the year with two console releases, which are the new 3DS XLs. Now, we didn't get the original size new 3DS that Japan got, but we did get both of these. The standard versions were released in black and red colors, and they were kind of the DSi of the 3DS. So they could still play all of your 3DS games, they still play all of your DS games, but they also have a little bit more power. You can download more games here than you can on the original 3DS. Virtual Console was introduced, so you can download Virtual Console games, but only on the new 3DS. And they came out with two special editions to coincide with the two big games that were coming out right then. The Zelda Majora's Mask special edition and the Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate Special Edition. We were lucky to get both of these at launch. They sold out pretty quickly. A lot of people were looking for them, so we grabbed these instead of the original. So the first big release to coincide with those is Zelda Majora's Mask 3D. Just like Ocarina of Time 3D, this is an update to the sequel for N64, Majora's Mask. That game was a really interesting game where you had 3 days to complete all the objectives, and if you didn't complete the objectives in 3 days, the moon crashed into the kingdom and everybody died and you had to start all over, although there were some aspects of progression. The dungeons you completed stayed completed, but progress you made in other side quests may be reset. So they give you a strict time limit to kind of get through the things you need to do, and you need to manage those 3 days over and over and over to complete the game. Some people found that very frustrating. I found it really refreshing for a Zelda game. It's really interesting to see something different in the series, and I really appreciated that they tried that. The 3DS takes away some of that annoyance by easing the timing. They also add in some helpful stuff. There's a couple new features in here like fishing, which wasn't in the original, and of course, just like the original, it plays in 3D. The textures have all been updated. It looks great. It is a great way to play this game. Next up is Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate. I don't have the game. It was pre-installed on this. Unfortunately, Majora's Mask wasn't pre-installed on this, and since I think they were about the same price, maybe $10 more or less, that's kind of a shame. But yeah, Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, the follow-up to Monster Hunter 3, which really introduced North America to the series. 4 is the first game to have online multiplayer, so you don't have to play co-op anymore. That makes it a lot easier for people to build communities and play together. It also had a new kind of side quest system where you got quests through the guild and you could trade stuff through Street Pass. It was a pretty interesting game, but you know, like Monster Hunter, it was really deep, really difficult to get into, so I don't blame you if you didn't get into it, but if you were into Monster Hunter, this is probably one that you really played. Next up is Story of Seasons, which is the kind of true successor to the original Harvest Moon series. I think I've talked about this a bunch of times in previous episodes, so I won't get into it here. But yeah, this is the true follow-up to Harvest Moon, and this game features a bunch of new features. The things that you grow on your farm, you could sell through the trading post, and you could buy things from other traders. That was a really interesting mechanic in the game. They also introduced some multiplayer features, so you could visit certain parts of other players' farms, and you could trade farm data through Street Pass. The character customization from Harvest Moon games is back, but this time you also have a rival, so there's a new rival farm mechanic introduced, which is really interesting and leads to some interesting competitions in the game. And you can also set up a wildlife reserve so you can have new kinds of exotic animals around your farm. Next up is Etrian Mystery Dungeon, which is a kind of combination of Chunsoft's Mystery Dungeon series and the Etrian Odyssey series. This plays out like a traditional roguelike dungeon crawler, but it uses the kind of theme and settings and character classes from Etrian Odyssey. So both of those series are pretty hardcore, whether you're into roguelikes or these tough first-person dungeon crawlers. Definitely a niche genre, but if you were fans of both of those, this is an amazing crossover for you. Next up was Pokemon Rumble World. Now this was a really interesting game that was originally released as a download. It is a cool game where you play as Pokemon toys, these like wind-up toys kind of, and you go through these like top-down action levels using your skills to beat other Pokemon, and you get a chance to capture them, and then you can use those toys in other levels. So just a really fun kind of take on Pokemon, worth checking out if you're into Pokemon. The first notable game that only plays on the new Nintendo 3DS is Xenoblade Chronicles 3D. This is a kind of step-down port of the Wii game, Xenoblade Chronicles, which was really hard to find at the time and very expensive. So if you didn't get it for Wii and really wanted to check it out, this was a great way to check it out. It is a bit of a step back. It doesn't quite play as well as the original game, but it's a decent compromise for a portable system. This also used the Shulk amiibo from the Super Smash Bros. Amiibo line, so you could use that in-game. Next up is Shin Megami Tensei Devil Survivor 2 Record Breaker, which is something I covered in my Shin Megami Tensei overview. This is an expanded version of the original Devil Survivor 2, which came out for the original DS. It has a new epilogue and some voice acting, basically the features from the original Shin Megami Tensei Devil Survivor Overclocked that they didn't include in the original Devil Survivor 2. Following that, we had a take on the Japanese mobile smash hit Puzzles and Dragons by Capcom. This was Puzzle and Dragon Z and Super Mario Bros. Edition. The game was kind of 2 games in one, so you could play the original mobile game, which is a block matching puzzle game where you're going through a dungeon, you encounter monsters, and you match blocks of the same color to do attacks and try and get through the dungeon as quick as possible or before the enemies destroy you. The Super Mario version that was included was a really cool take on it. It played a little differently, it looked really different. It was a good kind of way to mash Mario into that gameplay genre. You went through the Mario worlds and everything was Mario themed, and it was just a cool take on that. Next up is Etrian Odyssey Untold 2, The Fafnir Night. Now this is just like the first Etrian Odyssey Untold, a remake of Etrian Odyssey 2. You can play the original mode or you can play this new mode, which gives you a preset party of defined characters and gives you a story that's told with cutscenes and more dialogue and just a more directed story experience than the traditional mode. Like the previous games, it's still a very difficult experience, but there's a new picnic mode you can choose that basically lets you breeze through the game. So if you're interested in Etrian Odyssey, but don't want to put in the time, this may be one worth checking out to see what the series is like. Next up is LBX, Little Battler's Experience, which is the first game in the Denboro Senkai series to come out over here. Now this is a series of action RPGs by Level 5, in which you play these little toy robots that look like SD Gundams. The game is a port of a game that was released on the PSP, and it's a fun little action RPG. Next up is Hatsume Miku, Project Mirai DX, which is a kind of spin-off of the Project Diva series. This is all chibi styled. It is actually the second game in the series, but the first one never came out over here. Like the Project Diva games, it's just a rhythm game with songs by Vocaloids. You can choose to use the buttons or touchscreen to play, and there's some additional mini-games included. Next up is Senran Kagura 2 Deep Crimson. This is the sequel to the first game in the series, which was released for the 3DS in Japan, but never came out over here. That was Senran Kagura Burst, and that game takes place before the Vita game, Shinobi Versus, which came out. It is a side-scrolling action game with a focus on anime-style female ninjas. The game lets you have a partner that you can issue commands to during pair battles. It's an interesting game for fans of that series. If you want to see kind of where that series came from and what the first entry was like, this is one definitely worth checking out. Next up we get Skylanders Superchargers Racing. Now this is the first time the portable entry isn't the only way to play this version of the game. Even though it's still a different version than the main console Superchargers, this game was also released on the Wii. So it's a little less important for the 3DS because I think the Wii is a better way to play it. But if you have the other ones on 3DS and wanted more ways to use your figures, this is definitely one you probably checked out. The game has much more of a focus on racing. I think all of the adventure segments are gone and it's just racing, but that's good for a portable game. Next up, we finally got the new 3DS in its original form, and it was released as the Animal Crossing Happy Home Designer bundle. So Happy Home Designer, I think, was pre-installed on it. It came with plates that had Animal Crossing themed art on it. It was most notable just for being the original size. It was like the white version that came out in Japan, but had some covers with Animal Crossing art. Came out alongside Animal Crossing Happy Home Designer, which itself came out alongside the first set of Animal Crossing Amiibo cards. Now this is a game where you kind of take on requests to design homes. You unlock new items as you go along, and you just have to kind of design homes to match what the villagers tell you they want. There were a total of 4 series of cards for this game specifically. Each one, I think, had the same characters, but they were in their different seasonal costumes. And, that was a big thing for a lot of people who were into Amiibo to start collecting these cards. Overall, the game is interesting, but it really lacks objectives or objectives that are measurable in any way. Unfortunately, I think my big problem with the game was that it seemed like no matter what you did, the villagers always loved it, which kind of fits in with that Animal Crossing mentality, but doesn't really make it a fun game when you can't really do better or worse at it. So again, really just for hardcore Animal Crossing fans, but worth noting because it did kick off the whole amiibo card craze. Speaking of amiibos, Chibi Robo Ziplash is a 2D side-scrolling platformer game starring Chibi Robo. It launched with a Chibi Robo amiibo, and for a while that was the only way to get him, was to buy the bundle that came with the game, although later it was released separately. Like I said, it's a side-scrolling game where you have to use his plug tail to, move through the environment, which is an interesting mechanic. Although the game wasn't quite as good as the previous Chibi Robo games, it was still an interesting follow-up, and it did have that really cute amiibo with it. Next up is Legend of Legacy, which is a turn-based RPG by the creator of the Saga series. So this is a series that is really love it or hate it. It is built similarly to the original Final Fantasy II, in which your characters don't get experience. Instead, they level up their stats individually by how they perform in battles. So it can end up being a really tedious system if it doesn't work well, which turns a lot of people off. Hopefully they figured it out by now, and it does work really well in this game. I've always found the series to be a little too frustrating. Like the previous games in the Saga series, this one is open world and lets you choose from 7 different playable characters. Each character has their own storyline, and it's got a real big open world concept where you're not quite sure where you're supposed to go. You just explore and keep getting your butt kicked by enemies that are way too hard for you until you kind of figure out where to go next. So I hope this one is balanced itself in a way that makes it fun to play. I hope to check it out one day, but for fans of the Saga series, this one is definitely worth checking out. Next up is The Legend of Zelda Triforce Heroes, which is kind of a semi-sequel to A Link Between Worlds, which is really interesting because it feels a lot like Four Swords Adventures, which was itself a kind of follow-up to Link to the Past. This game really uses the 3D aspect of the 3DS to let you stack up your links. So instead of kind of linking up side by side like Four Swords Adventures, they stack on top of each other, and that lets you get through puzzles in different interesting ways. You can play alone with some dummy characters that you line up yourself, but this game is really designed to be played multiplayer with 3 players. The game lets you collect items that you can use to craft different costumes, and those costumes give your characters different abilities. So that's a really interesting progression system we haven't seen in a Zelda game before. There's also a competitive Coliseum mode, so you can go up against your friends that way if you want. Next up is Yokai Watch, which is level 5's Pokemon-like RPG, in which the players make friends with over 200 ghosts, and use them in battle against other yokai. The game was released in Japan over 2 years before its North American release, and for a while it rivaled Pokemon in terms of popularity. It had an anime, manga series, and tons of merchandise. In the game, the player can get new medals that let them summon different yokai by using items in battles, different side quests, and mini-games, and you can buy them in the game. There are 8 classes of yokai and some legendary yokai. Next up is Stella Glow, which is the last game to be developed by ImagePoc. Now this game was designed to celebrate their history, including a lot of niche RPGs like the Seventh Dragon series, Luminous Arc series, and other weird Japanese RPGs that only the most hardcore people checked out. In the game, the player has to bring together 4 witches to save his hometown. You can spend time with the different witches to increase your relationship with them, which makes them stronger, and it's an RPG with traditional turn-based battles. Next up is Pokemon Super Mystery Dungeon, which continues the 3D style used in the previous Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games. This one has all of the 720 Pokemon that have been released in the series by the time it came out, and is very similar to the previous games in the series. It is a roguelike dungeon crawling RPG in which you play a human that has been transformed into a Pokemon. Your choices to play as are any of the starting Pokemon from any of the generations up to this point, or a couple extras, like I think one of the legendaries and Pikachu. So for fans of the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series, this is just another one with a new story and new characters and way more Pokemon. And the last thing of the year released, this I didn't even know came out, but it is the other version of the new 3DS, which was in its original size. This is the new 3DS Super Mario Black Edition. So basically just like the Animal Crossing one, but it's the black version and features Mario art. It's worth pointing out that later on you could get different covers for this size of 3DS, but I don't think you could get them through traditional channels. You had to get them either through Nintendo's website or the Nintendo store in New York. And that's it for 2015. Let's get right into the 2016 releases, starting off with Mario & Luigi Paper Jam. Now, this is a game that combines the two series, Mario & Luigi with Paper Mario. The gameplay is very much like Mario & Luigi. It's more of an RPG like those games. The writing is really good. The story is that a book is opened up in Peach's castle and all of the Paper Mario characters and villains come out of it, which leads to a bunch of funny situations where there are paper and regular versions of all the Mario characters interacting with each other. Mario and Luigi team up with Paper Mario to try and get his characters and the bad guys from his world back into the book. It is a fun game. Paper Mario series I find hit and miss, but the Mario and Luigi series are always fun, so worth checking out if you are into that series. Or if you haven't played either of those series, this is a great place to check out what that's like. The game uses the Paper Mario style to introduce some really interesting puzzles into the Mario and Luigi world, so there's a lot of interesting things added by combining those two universes. Next up is our first special edition, Final Fantasy Explorers. So this was released in a special edition and regular edition. I believe the special edition was exclusive to the Square Enix online store. This is Final Fantasy's take on the Monster Hunter formula. So you create a character and choose a class, and you go out and face big Final Fantasy monsters. You could play 4-player local or online multiplayer, and if you played single player, you could use monsters as your other party members. It's a pretty good take on the Monster Hunter formula, but I don't think it did as well as I think it should have. Next up is Project X Zone 2, which is technically the third game in the series, following Namco X Capcom and Project X Zone 1. If you didn't play Project X Zone 1, it is a strategy RPG in which you have these teams that are made up of 2 units, and when you go into a fight, you kind of build combos with those 2 units. It is a really cool take on an SRPG. If you like characters from Bandai Namco, Capcom, or Sega, I mean, there's a ton of characters in here. There's also some Nintendo characters for the first time. It is a really cool game. It is worth checking out if you're into SRPGs. The combat is really fun and different for a tactics game, and there's just a ton of fan service in here. Our next special edition is one that Nintendo pissed off a lot of people with, which is the Fire Emblem Fates Special Edition. So technically on this day we got 2 games, Fire Emblem Fates Birthright and Conquest. And both of those games were readily available on launch, but the special edition sold out incredibly fast. It was really rare, hard to get. I think I had to get this from a scalper, but luckily I didn't have to pay the crazy prices that it went for most people. But it's a shame Nintendo didn't make more for a reason I'll get into later. Both games start with the same first couple chapters. You play as a character who was originally part of one kingdom, but adopted by another kingdom, and the 2 kingdoms are at war with each other. And after the first couple chapters, when you find out the truth, you can decide to stay with your adopted family and fight with them, or you can go back to your original birth family and fight against your adopted family. The game uses a bunch of the same maps after that, but the story changes depending on which side you go with. And if you're playing Birthright, that's the game where you side with your original birth family. If you're playing Conquest, that's the game where you're siding with your adopted family. The other differences in the games are the kind of gameplay styles, let's call them. Birthright was designed to appeal to people who played Fire Emblem Awakening, so it is very much like that. It's a little smoother experience, not quite as tough, but still pretty tough. But Conquest is the game to appeal to people who loved the series before them. It is really hard. It is designed, even though both games have different difficulty modes, that's the game that was designed to play more like the original Fire Emblem games. Shortly after launch, a 3rd scenario was released as DLC, which is the Revelation scenario, and that's what makes the special edition so important. This is the only way to get that physically. So this is the only edition that comes with all 3 scenarios on one cart. The Revelation scenario is a shorter experience, but it really answers some of the questions that come up during the other 2 scenarios. After that, we get the Mega Man Legacy Collection, which came out for many consoles. The collection included Mega Mans 1 through 6, the original NES games, and had emulation options to kind of let the players choose how they wanted those games to look. The reason the 3DS version is notable is because a special edition was released that was bundled with a gold Mega Man amiibo, and that was the only way to get that. Next up, we get Return to Popolo Crow, A Story of Seasons Fairy Tale. Now, this is a combination of 2 series, but one you've probably never heard of. Popolo Crow was a turn-based tactics dungeon crawling RPG that was released in Japan. There are a couple entries in that series. The only one that came out over here was for PSP, and this takes that series and combines it with the Harvest Moon / Story of Seasons farming mechanics. So if you're a fan of both of those series, like Michelle is, you have to play this game. Unfortunately, I don't think it does either the farming sim or the tactics dungeon crawling experience as well as its original sources, but it's still a really interesting thing that this came out. After that, we get Mario and Sonic at the Rio 2016 Olympic Games. There's not really much to say here other than, it's another entry in that series. Right after that, we got Hyrule Warriors Legends. And it was a scaled-down port of Hyrule Warriors, which was the Wii U game that took the Zelda theme and worked it into a Dynasty Warriors gameplay style. That game was really fun. It may be my favorite Dynasty Warriors style game. This one adds a bunch of new stuff to it, but the most notable one is to be able to play as the female Link. Next up, a game I have, but I didn't pull it out for this. I gotta figure out where it is. It is Bravely Second and Lair, which is a follow-up to the original Bravely Default RPG, which itself was a kind of spiritual successor to the DS game Final Fantasy IV Heroes of Light. Now, this game takes place 2 years after the story in the original title. It centers around a new character. The gameplay is fairly similar. It uses the same overworld and some locations from the original game, but there are some minor improvements, including this new ability to chain battles together so you can redo battles at higher difficulties to try and earn more experience and gold. Other than that, it's just a continuation of the story with some new areas. And if you're a fan of that first game, it's definitely worth checking out. This was released in both a regular edition and a big special edition, which is why I didn't remember to pull it out for this. But yeah, it's a really cool throwback RPG. If you're into those old like NES-style JRPGs, this is one you want to look into. Next up is Langrisser Reincarnation Tensei. So I've heard this game is actually pretty bad. I haven't had a chance to play it yet. I only just picked it up recently. But the Langrisser series is one that really interests me. Only one of the games came out over here, which is the game Warsong for Genesis, but it is an amazing tactics game, and I really look forward to seeing what the series does as I start to play through some of the Japanese entries. This was supposed to kind of bring the series back, but from what I've heard, it doesn't quite live up to expectations, so that's kind of a shame, but still I need to play it for myself and decide for myself, and I hope that maybe other people are wrong. Next up is Sega 3D Classics Collection, and this is a collection of original Sega arcade and Genesis games that have been updated to use the 3DS's 3D mechanic. What makes this really interesting as a collection to me is that a bunch of the games on here are stuff that haven't been released in any other form. So there's games like Puyo Puyo 2, Power Drift, Fantasy Zone 2, Galaxy Force 2, and Fantasy Zone W and Fantasy Zone Maze Walker. And there's a couple classic games in here too that have been released a ton of times, like Sonic the Hedgehog, Thunderblade, Altered Beast. But overall, a decent collection of 9 different Sega arcade games. Next up is Kirby Planet Robobot, which is kind of a follow-up to Kirby's Triple Deluxe. So similar to that game, there's 3 different modes, but the main mode is the traditional Kirby platformer. And what's new and unique in this one is that now Kirby can get a big mech suit at some points in the levels. So you can play this mech Kirby. It's really fun. It's an interesting addition to the game. Other 2 modes include Kirby Clash, a 4-player class-based action RPG, and 3D Rumble, which is an interesting top-down maze-like action game. You can also unlock a boss rush mode, and you can unlock the ability to play the main campaign as Meta Knight. Next up is Zero Escape 3, Zero's Time Dilemma. This was a much requested follow-up to Virtue's Last Reward. It has been also released on other consoles, but I think the 3DS is the best way to play it. This game follows up on the stories of Virtue's Last Reward. It's kind of both a prequel and sequel to that game because of how the story goes. Like the previous game, it is a mix of visual novel segments and these room escape puzzle segments. So if you're into puzzle games, like adventure-style puzzle games, this is one definitely worth checking out. The story is amazing, so you'll probably want to go back and play the first 2 games first because you really need to know what's going on. The visual novel segments do the same things as the previous games where you have multiple choices, but you kind of have to see every different avenue before you can unlock the true ending and find out what's really going on in the game. Next up is 7th Dragon 3 Code VFD. Now, this is the first game in the 7th Dragon series to come out in English. It is the 4th game in the series. This is this dungeon crawling turn-based RPG series where you create a character, recruit other characters into your party, and kind of scale through a dungeon. The game takes place in a futuristic Tokyo setting, which is a really interesting setting for this kind of game. And I can't really do it justice with words. The descriptions might sound really generic, but in truth, the game is something special. It has a ton of fans. It is a really good take on that kind of turn-based dungeon crawling RPG mechanic. If you're into Japanese RPGs, this is definitely one you want to check out. Next up is Monster Hunter Generations, which I never played because Monster Hunter games are just way too involved for me. Again, this is pretty much Monster Hunter 5 in all but name. So if you were really into Ultimate 4, you probably check this out. These games are hard to go back to because once the community dies down, you really need people to play with, but for its time, I'm sure Monster Hunter fans would be annoyed if I didn't mention it. So definitely a notable game for Monster Hunter fans. Next up is another game I picked up, but I forgot to bring it out. That is Metroid Prime Federation Force. Now, I waited a long time to find this game for cheap because I did not want to pay full price for it. This game is kind of the black sheep of the Metroid series. Unfortunately, I've heard some people say it's actually a decent game, so I hope that's the case. It looks like it has nothing in common with the previous Metroid games. It's a spin-off of Metroid Prime Hunters, which was released for the DS, so a kind of first-person shooter in which you play a member of the Federation Force. The game has a blast ball mode, which is how they announced it at E3 before revealing it was a Metroid game, which is a 3-on-3 soccer-like game where you pilot mech suits and try and throw a ball around trying to get it into the goal. It looks fun and interesting. But now that I have it, I can play it and judge for myself. Another game that has its fans, but I haven't had a chance to really check the series out, Style Savvy Fashion Forward. This is the third game in the Style Savvy series. It doesn't feature much new in terms of gameplay from what I've seen. It just kind of features more of everything from the previous game. So this series is apparently much better than it sounds. It is a series where you manage a fashion boutique, but it's not one of those like Ubisoft Imagine games. Apparently this one by Nintendo has some interesting depth and gameplay to it. So if you're into sim titles and maybe you were shying off because it's a fashion game, it might be worth checking out. Next up is Dragon Quest VII Fragments of the Forgotten Past. Now this is a really cool game because it is a remake of the Dragon Warrior 7 game that came out on PS1 here. Now that game was notorious for being just an interesting Dragon Warrior game, but incredibly drawn out, a lot of issues, especially with the translation, and finally we get this kind of definitive good way to play it. So if you play Dragon Quest IX, I believe this game was built with that engine, so that's kind of how it plays out. Completely different from the original, but it retains that same story and characters, and definitely a game worth checking out for Dragon Warrior Dragon Quest fans. Next up we get Shin Megami Tensei 4 Apocalypse. This is the follow-up to Shin Megami Tensei 4, so it is a sequel that takes place after the neutral ending in that game. This one has a new main character that you play as. So like the other Shin Megami Tensei games, you recruit demons, you fuse them and negotiate with them to get them, and use them to battle other demons. Like the other Shin Megami Tensei games, it is a very hard turn-based RPG, but a really rewarding one. It's just the style in it and the stories are incredibly unique and special and worth checking out. Next up is River City Tokyo Rumble, which is a follow-up to River City Ransom, which is a NES game that's become a cult hit over the past couple years, and so it's great to have a true sequel to it. The Kunio series in Japan has had a ton of different kind of Olympic-style games and dodgeball games and kind of arena games, but it's never had a real follow-up, as far as I know, to the traditional open world beat 'em up that River City Ransom was. So like River City Ransom, this is a game where you kind of raise up your character stats by earning money, by beating enemy and eating food and getting strong enough to kind of fight the bosses. It is a very cool game worth checking out. If you're into River City Ransom, you have got to check it out. Next up is Sonic Boom Fire and Ice, which is the third game in the Sonic Boom spin-off series. Apparently this is a follow-up to the 2014 game Sonic Boom Shattered Crystals, which I don't think I mentioned previously, so I'm going to cover that now. Apparently Sonic Boom Shattered Crystals was a side-scrolling adventure game with an emphasis on exploration. It had 4 playable characters with unique skills, and the player could instantly switch between characters to get through the levels and find secrets and stuff, and that sounds right up my alley. It sounds like a really interesting mix of Sonic and Lost Vikings. Fire and Ice is apparently very similar, but adds Amy Rose as a playable character. Levels also include elements of fire and ice as obstacles, and Sonic can kind of infuse himself with fire and ice powers to help get past those. This one is apparently the best received of all the games, so if it sounds interesting to you, it's probably the one worth checking out of all the Sonic Boom games. Next up we get Yokai Watch 2. It came in 2 versions this time, both Fleshy Souls and Bony Spirits. Like Pokemon, the games are very similar except for minor differences. The big one is that each game includes 12 exclusive yokai. The story features a time travel mechanic that lets players travel to the past, and there are over 150 new yokai in the game. Following that, we get Azure Striker Gunvolt Striker Pack. Now, this is really just a physical release of Azure Striker Gunvolt 1 and Azure Striker Gunvolt 2, which are Mega Man style platformers. So if you were into those games, it's cool to have a physical release of those. Next up is Corpse Party, which is a port of the PSP digital game. One of my favorite horror series, and this version is really notable for being the only way you can physically get the game over here. But it's such a great game that I really want a physical version of it, so I picked this up. This version is slightly different from the PSP version, but not in really many notable ways. I think the last chapter has some additional elements to it, and there's some additional mini stories you can unlock that are different from the PSP version, but overall, this is a really cool game. Like the PSP version, it is a remake of an indie RPG Maker game, but there's no turn-based battles in it. Everything is just exploration. It plays out more like a visual novel, so you move around in this top-down RPG style world. Everything is like a 16-bit kind of RPG, and you just kind of try to do things in the right order and avoid ghosts and try not to get killed as you move through the chapters. It is a really cool horror experience. If you're into kind of 16-bit RPGs and horror games, it's probably one of the best experiences you can have. Next up is Mario Party Star Rush. So this is the next game in the Mario Party series. In this one, the main mode has each player playing as a Toad instead of different Mario characters, but you can recruit different Mario characters to your team. The biggest change to the game now is that the players can move in any direction they want on the board. They don't need to follow the specific paths that the board had laid out in previous games. The game also introduces some boss battles, and it has amiibo support, so you can use amiibos to get items and allies, or you can play as that character in the shuffle mode. Next up, another special edition we did some unboxing for when it came out. That is Harvest Moon Skytree Village. So unlike the Story of Seasons games, this is the follow-up to Natsume's Harvest Moon series, which never came out in Japan. So a North American exclusive. It follows up on Natsume's last game, which was The Lost Valley, and plays very similarly to that. You can create a male or a female character, and you just kind of tend to your farm. The story in this one revolves around trying to revive the 7 sky trees and restore the land. So it's your traditional kind of Harvest Moon, but this series I don't think has been as well received as Story of Seasons since the kind of switch over, but for Harvest Moon fans, definitely worth knowing about. Next up is Pokemon Sun and Moon. I have the Moon version. So just the next entry in the Pokemon series, Sun and Moon follows up on a lot of the stuff that was done in X and Y. It uses the same engine. It looks and feels the same. Although, like every Pokemon game, it is a whole new story with some new Pokemon. I believe there are 80 new Pokemon in this one. It also takes place in the new Alola region, which is based on Hawaii, and it's just a bunch of connected islands. One interesting feature is that it has Pokemon that return from previous games but are kind of tropical versions of those Pokemon. So you can see a different Rattata and different kinds of other Pokemon that are... It's pretty interesting to see these new sprites designed for those same old Pokemon. The game was also sold in a dual pack where you could get both games in one like nice steelbook, but that sold out really quickly. Next up is Dragon Ball Fusions, which is an RPG based on an original storyline where the new characters wish to hold the greatest martial arts tournament and, everyone from the Dragon Ball universe gets involved. Like the Dragon Ball Xenoverse games, the player can create their own avatar to play as. Fusions play an important part in the battle mechanics where the characters can fuse together to temporarily create a stronger form or to perform an ultra move. Following that, we get another port of a Wii U game. This is Super Mario Maker for the 3DS. So Super Mario Maker was probably one of the best reasons to own a Wii U. It was just a really fun experience. A whole bunch of great communities sprung up around it. This one is a decent port. The big problem with it is that the community aspects weren't quite as strong in it. The sharing mechanics weren't quite up to par of the Wii U version, which itself was already pretty limited. So it was tough to kind of build communities around this to get your friends involved, and which is a shame because it's such a great idea that worked so well on the Wii U and they just couldn't get it right on the 3DS. Still, if you've never played it, it is a cool way to play like 100 new Mario stages built by Nintendo. The last notable game for 2016, in my opinion, is Animal Crossing New Leaf Welcome Amiibo Edition. So this was actually a free update to the Animal Crossing New Leaf game. If you already had that game that was released years ago, you could just download this update. But it was also released physically all on one cart. So the big change to this game is that it now uses all of the amiibo cards and amiibo figures that came out for Animal Crossing. It also introduced a new series of amiibo cards that had 50 cards in it. And the game introduced this new campsite that you could visit. So that's mostly what the amiibo cards did, was let you visit those characters at their campsites. So it's an interesting follow-up and a good way to add amiibos to an older game. I wish Nintendo had done this with more games. And that is it for 2015-2016. 2017 has had a ton of great games too, so I might turn this into a yearly thing just to get them out quicker. So check out some of those games and, stay tuned for other retrospectives I'll be doing. I'm going to try and get through as much as I can in the upcoming year. See you next time.